There is a village in the hills of Hessen, in the middle of Germany, called Wichmannshausen. You would not stop there unless you already knew someone who lived there. It is the kind of place that does not appear in history books. Half-timbered houses, a Protestant church at the end of the lane, wood smoke in the autumn air. In 1906, a boy was born in Kassel in central Germany, named Kurt Reuber. He grew up not far from Wichmannshausen, the village where he would later serve as pastor. He was raised in a devout Protestant household, and from early on showed an unusual combination of inclinations toward theology, toward medicine, and toward drawing. He studied theology at the University of Marburg, then medicine, then began to practice both simultaneously, a village pastor who also made house calls, who sat with the dying in 1 hour and delivered sermons in the next. His parish was in Wichmannshausen. His patients were the same people who filled his pews on Sundays. But there was a third thing, quieter than the other two. He drew, not as a hobby, not as relaxation. He drew the way certain people read, as a form of attention, a way of looking at the world slowly enough to actually see it. He kept a sketchbook wherever he went. He drew the faces of his parishioners, elderly farmers, village women, children who sat still long enough to be caught on paper. He believed that every human face deserved to be studied carefully, that looking at someone, really looking, was itself a form of respect. He had studied under Albert Schweitzer, the great physician and theologian, who argued that reverence for life was not a sentiment, but a philosophical position, the foundation of all ethics. Something of that conviction settled into Reuber and never left. By the late 1930s, he had a full life, a wife named Martha, 3 young children, a house he knew well, a community that knew him well, a parish where he was trusted, and a practice where he was needed. He was 33 years old. His sketchbook was half filled. In October of 1939, 6 weeks after Germany invaded Poland, Kurt Reuber received his conscription papers. He packed his medical bag. He said goodbye to his children. He kissed Martha in the doorway of their house and walked down the lane toward the church. He did not look back. And then, Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, Germany had a problem it could not solve. Its tanks, its aircraft, its entire war machine ran on oil, and it was running out. The synthetic fuel plants at home could not keep pace with the demand of a war being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. Without oil, the Wehrmacht would stop, simply stop. In the field, mid-campaign, engines silent. There was oil in the Caucasus, enormous reserves at Baku on the western shore of the Caspian Sea, enough to fuel the war for years. The German High Command believed that if they could seize those fields, the outcome of the entire conflict could change. But to reach the Caucasus, they needed to cross the southern Russian steppe, and to secure that crossing, to protect the northern flank of the entire operation, they needed to control one particular city on one particular river, the city on the Volga, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, the German army launched a massive offensive eastward across the open steppe of southern Russia. The steppe in summer is flat and enormous and almost featureless, dry grass stretching to a horizon that never seems to get any closer. German soldiers crossed it for weeks. They crossed it in heat that rose in visible waves from the ground, in columns that stretched back further than anyone could see, in a direction that felt increasingly like the edge of the world. On the 23rd of August 1942, the Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad for 12 consecutive hours. 600 aircraft, 40,000 civilians killed in a single day. The city was burning before a single German soldier entered it, and then the soldiers entered it anyway. What followed does not have a clean military name. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Not battles for rivers or hills, not the movement of armies across maps, battles for staircases, for windows, for single rooms in buildings that no longer had roofs. The same factory changed hands 13 times in 1 week. Men died, taking floors of buildings that had already been destroyed. The civilian population, the women, the children, the elderly who had not or could not flee, lived in the rubble alongside the soldiers, in cellars, in the ruins of their own homes. The Volga was behind them. The German army was in front. There was nowhere to go. A Soviet woman crossing a destroyed street in September 1942 carried a small child on her back, with both the child's arms around her neck. We know this because someone wrote it down. We do not know their names. We know only that the child looked directly at whoever was watching, and that their eyes held no particular expression. They had run out of particular expressions. Kurt Reuber was somewhere in this. Not as a combatant, as a doctor. He operated in bunkers, on rough surfaces, improvised into surgical tables by whatever light was available. A single lantern, a crack in a ruined wall, a candle. He worked on soldiers who had been shot, frozen, starved. He used what he had. He ran out of things. He wrote to Martha almost every day. At the bottom of many of his letters, in the margins, in the corners of the pages, in whatever space remained, he drew small portraits of the men he was treating. He drew faces of soldiers the way he had drawn faces of parishioners, with the same attention, the same refusal to look away. He could not stop drawing. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, one of the most decisive military operations of the entire war. 2 enormous armored columns, one from the north, one from the south, swept around the outer edges of the German position across the open steppe. They drove fast, they drove hard, and within 4 days, they closed. The ring sealed west of Stalingrad at a town called Kalak on the Don River. 300,000 German soldiers were now surrounded. Hitler ordered the 6th Army to hold its position. Relief was coming. The Luftwaffe would supply them by air. They were to trust the plan and hold fast. The Luftwaffe had promised 300 tons of supplies per day. On good days, they delivered 90. On most days, considerably less. The soldiers in the pocket watched the aircraft from a distance, small, high, too few, and understood something their commanders would not yet say. The temperature dropped. December on the Russian steppe is not winter, in any sense that most people would recognize. It is a different category of cold. Minus 20 degrees, minus 30. The kind of cold that freezes rifle bolts, turns axle grease to concrete, and kills horses in their harness overnight. Daily rations were cut, then cut again, then cut again. By December, each man received 100 grams of bread per day, approximately the size of a fist. That was the day's food. There was no way out. Kurt Reuber continued to work, operated by candlelight, on men who were dying of wounds, of frostbite, of dysentery, the accumulated effects of being human bodies in conditions that human bodies are not designed to survive. He used instruments he cleaned and reused. He used bandages he ran out of. He worked on men he could not save and did the work anyway. He wrote to Martha when he could. In late November he wrote, and these are his actual words.
I wondered for a long while what I should paint, and in the end I decided on a Madonna, or Mother and Child. I have turned my hole in the frozen mud into a studio. There are no proper materials, and I have used a Russian map for paper.
He was 36 years old. He had been in Stalingrad for 3 months. Christmas was coming. Outside the bunker, the temperature was minus 30 degrees. Inside, the air was cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough to kill you. There was a single oil lamp, a few candles, a low ceiling of rough timber and earth, the sound of artillery in the distance, always in the distance, never stopping. So familiar by now, it had stopped registering as a sound and become instead a kind of permanent weather. It was Christmas Eve. A small group of soldiers sat together and sang. They sang quietly, the way people sing when they are not entirely certain they have the right to. A carol they all knew the words to. Their voices were unsteady. They were hungry and cold and afraid, and they sang anyway, not because it helped exactly, but because there was nothing else left that was recognizably human to do. Kurt Reuber was not singing. He had found a large piece of captured Soviet military map paper, roughly 1 meter by 1.5 meters, the backside blank. He had a charcoal stick. He laid the paper flat on a rough wooden table and he began. He worked through the evening. He worked through midnight. He worked by the light of a single oil lamp that cast warm amber across the white paper and left the rest of the room in a cold that the light could not reach. And then he was done. Around the border of the drawing, in his own handwriting, he wrote, Weihnachten im Kessel, 1942. Christmas in the Cauldron, 1942. And 3 words. Licht. Leben. Liebe. Light. Life. Love. He pinned the drawing to the bunker wall. And the soldiers came. They stood in front of it. Some still had their helmets on. Some held their helmets at their sides. One man placed his hand on the shoulder of the man standing next to him and left it there. They said nothing. There was nothing to say. Reuber wrote about that night.
As I opened the door of our bunker and my comrades entered, they stood as if spellbound, devoutly and deeply moved in silence, before the picture on the earthen wall beneath which a light burned on a piece of wood. The whole celebration passed under the impression of the picture, and they thoughtfully read the words, light, life, love.
He called it simply the Madonna. A mother holding a child inside the cold. Outside the bunker that night, not every man who walked out came back in. By early January 1943, the shape of what was coming was no longer in doubt. The relief force sent to break through the Soviet encirclement had been turned back 50 kilometers short of the pocket. The airlift was failing. The rations were almost gone. Field Marshal Paulus had requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout and been refused. Kurt Reuber understood what this meant. He rolled the Madonna drawing carefully around a length of pipe, wrapped it in cloth, and tied it with cord. Then he carried it to his commanding officer, Wilhelm, who was ill and who had a place on one of the last Luftwaffe evacuation flights out of the pocket. He pressed the rolled drawing into Gross's hands and said, "Make sure it reaches my wife." On the 16th of January, 1943, one of the last regular Luftwaffe aircraft left Stalingrad. The Stalingrad Madonna was on it. Kurt Reuber was not. There were too many wounded. On the 2nd of February, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered what remained of the German Sixth Army, becoming the first German field marshal ever to surrender to an enemy. He walked out of the ruins of his final headquarters and into Soviet captivity. His coat hung off him. He had lost 30 pounds in 3 months. Of the 300,000 soldiers who had entered the Stalingrad pocket, 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 ever came home. Kurt Reuber was taken to a prisoner of war camp at Yelabuga, east of Moscow. He continued working as a doctor. He drew a second Madonna there, smaller, on camp paper, for the men around him. He called it the Prisoner's Madonna. He wrote to Martha when he could. He asked after the children. He asked whether the drawing had arrived safely. He died of typhus on the 20th of January, 1944. He was 37 years old. He is buried at Yelabuga. He never came home. He left an unfinished letter on his bunk. The sentence stopped in the middle of a line. The Stalingrad Madonna reached Martha Reuber in the spring of 1943. She kept it through the end of the war, through everything that followed. In 1983, nearly 40 years after the battle ended, Reuber's 3 children donated it to the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church in Berlin at the encouragement of German Federal President Karl Carstens. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church had been bombed in 1943. Its tower was gutted and left deliberately as a ruin, a permanent scar, a wound kept open on purpose. A new chapel was built beside it. The broken tower stands in the middle of one of the busiest streets in Berlin, and the city moves around it, and it does not move. Inside the preserved ruin, in a small niche cut into the scarred stone wall, the Stalingrad Madonna hangs. It is exactly as Reuber drew it. The charcoal marks, the mother with her eyes closed, the child held against her, the Cyrillic map lines of Stalingrad still visible at the margins, and along the border, in his own handwriting, the words he wrote on Christmas Eve 1942. Weihnachten im Kessel 1942. Licht, Leben, Liebe. 3,500 people walk past it every single day. Most of them do not know his name. Kurt Reuber was one man, but the battle that surrounded him was something else entirely. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. It is estimated that over 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured across both sides, soldiers and civilians alike. It remains one of the deadliest battles in the history of human warfare. The men who fought there, German and Soviet, officer and conscript, were not born to be soldiers. They were farmers and factory workers, students and teachers, fathers and sons. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances by decisions made far above them. Most of them left no drawing on a wall. Most of them left nothing that survived. They left only their names in regimental records, if those records survived, or a grave marker in a military cemetery that looks exactly like the one beside it, or nothing at all. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who entered Soviet captivity after the surrender, fewer than 6,000 came home. The last German prisoners of Stalingrad were not released until 1955, more than a decade after the battle ended, more than a decade after it was over. It is difficult to hold that number in your mind, 91,000. So perhaps it is better to hold one face, one name, one letter that stopped in the middle of a line. The drawing that Kurt Reuber made on Christmas Eve 1942, in a frozen bunker, on the back of a captured map, by the light of a single lamp, has outlasted the war that surrounded it. It has outlasted everyone who stood before it that night. It has outlasted the city it was made in, and will outlast you and I.